Welcome to Book and Lounge. I'm your host, Jacqueline. In this episode, I'm joined by Taiwo and Katrina to discuss An African History of Africa from the Dawn of Humanity to Independence by Zeinab Badawi. Let's hear what everyone thought about the book. So the book covers African history prior to the arrival of the Europeans and goes all the way to the time the nation started getting their independence. So I guess we'll just go through what she's presented and discuss the merits of it and whether we learned anything that we didn't already know from it. So I'll start off, I guess, by just giving a brief summary of what I thought about it. There was a lot in the book that I hadn't really thought about or didn't really know. So, for example, in the section when she was dealing with Egypt. Now, I know that ancient times there were lots of traveling between the various countries and especially the Middle East area and all of that, and that there were plenty of relationships with various nations. But until I read this book, I hadn't really sat down to actually think about it. So, for example, the fact that there was a relationship with the Hittites, the Phoenicians, the Greeks, all of that, although you read about it in the Bible, it just never really crossed my mind to think Africa. And also, it was interesting the influence that actually the African countries and cultures and traditions that were influenced by these interactions, but also how their cultures influenced the cultures of the other people that actually they interacted with. So for me, it was just really good to read about that and to learn about that. And then she talks also about the ancient kingdoms in other parts of Africa prior to colonization. So the Asantes she talks about Mansa Musa, which I guess I knew a fair bit about because there's a lot of information out there about him. And then the Great Zimbabwe, which although I'd heard of, I really didn't know very much about who built it, why it was there, and so on. And then Shaka Zulu and so on. So I feel that there was a lot of information in this book that, although I had a brief knowledge of some of the things that she talked about, I didn't really know as much detail as she's presented in this book. So for me, it was a great eye-opener and also a great introduction to some of these areas. I enjoyed it, and I also found that it was an easy read. The only thing that I guess didn't sit very well with me is her situating herself in the book. So, for example, if she went to meet someone in a museum in some country, she would tell you how, she got there and how beautiful it was and how she felt. And I just thought, okay, it's a history book. Not really expecting you to be telling me how, what your experiences are. So other than that, I think it's a good book. And what did you think about it, Katrina?
Well, picking up on your last point, I also found that aspect of her style a little bit not for me, but I think that it's something that might appeal to quite a few people. Anyway, to go over it more sort of from the beginning, I think the book is a very good introduction to African history. It covers so much that inevitably you can't get a great depth of any particular thing because each chapter is a book in it. It could easily be a book or several books in itself. And so because of that, there's things that I knew a fair amount about already, in which case I sort of probably thought she didn't do enough. But then also the areas where I know very little, especially around the North Africa, the Africa, how do they say it? Ifriqiya and the Amazigh, which I don't really know much about. And she did go into quite some depth on, well, for me, it was depth because I didn't know anything about it. But if you already know something about it, I don't know, your view might be different. So, yes, I think the book is good. It's easy to read, but her voice in it, because she has made documentaries on this type of on African areas of African history. And some of it really does read like a documentary, the dialogue you would get, rather than what you'd expect in a history book, I think. Especially when, I mean, the title, which is an African history of Africa. Well, clearly she's got African roots. And then she seems to satisfy that criteria to me by going and talking to historians in the various countries where she's talking about, which is fine. But I was hoping to get more of the voice of people in the past, African people in the past. And of course, there aren't, well, it does exist, and but you've got to dig for it. And I would have liked to have seen more of that in her book than what I think was there.
So she
Is that?
says that she's used, is it the General History of Africa, which is
Yes,
a
which
collection of
is
books
yes,
that,
she does. She does quote from them quite a lot, doesn't she? And I think
yeah.
that's great. That's good. But I don't know. I think I'm being unreasonable because it's a broad sweep, and it's making clear to people who perhaps don't know that, who've got that impression there isn't any history in Africa, that actually there's a great deal of it.
Hmm.
Um,
And
and I
also, I
think,
think, sorry,
no, you carry on.
I was just going to say the one thing that came across for me was the variety of culture within the continent. Um, just so many different regions are so different that I think sometimes we lump Africa into one box and then we expect that everything and everyone is the same. What came across to me here was just the vast, number one, the vastness of the continent, and then also the huge differences between the people. And so sometimes when you think about the tribal issues and the wars and the disagreements between people within various parts of a country, this kind of, I guess for me, made me realize or made me understand more why those wars happen and why there's such a there's a, there's such a clash in cultures because the people are so different. And when the borders were drawn, you had people from this group, lumped together with people from another group who were completely different. So that's the other thing that I took from the book is just how vast the continent is and how so different we are, although we're all from the same continent.
Mm. But I think it's because of that you have to treat this book very much as an introduction,
Mhm.
because the vastness means that it's impossible for her to do more than scratch the surface of some different areas. But anybody who really, is becomes really fascinated with, or has a reason for wanting to know about a particular area, they need to use this as their sort of jumping off point, really.
I
I think.
agree. I absolutely agree with that. I think this is kind of like an appetizer. So if you've
Yes.
wanted to learn about the Great Zimbabwe, for example, this is kind of like an introduction to the Great Zimbabwe. And then you'd obviously go and do more deep research on the topic and learn a lot more. Because here, as you said, it is a vast continent, and for it to be, I think it's over 425 pages, you can't have the whole history of the whole of Africa within one book
Mm,
of 425 pages. And also, there are some regions that she just barely spoke about, like places like East Africa for me was very scarce.
mm,
She covered Ethiopia a lot, but otherwise, other areas within the East Africa area, she didn't really go into as much. And also parts of Southwest Africa, again, very
that's
little
very.
information on those areas. So I
Mm,
think, yeah, I do agree with you. Just definitely just an introduction. You'd have to do, if you wanted really more deep analysis and history of those many regions, you'd have to go in and use this as an intro and then go and actually do the research yourself in perhaps other books.
There's an issue that she addresses in to a certain extent about why we don't know much about African history and how it's kind of been suppressed or brushed aside through because of the colonial and those issues. And in a way that you could write a whole book about that as well.
Yeah,
But she sort of touches, because especially with Great Zimbabwe, where the white settlers were so some of them found it so difficult to believe that anybody anybody locally in Africa would have been able to build anything like it.
yeah,
And the ones who saw the evidence that actually they probably had, the early archaeologists who actually did say, oh, these have been built by African people, that was sort of quickly suppressed and swept aside. So yes, it's, and I'm sure I personally know a little bit about that, but I'm sure that same argument, there must be other examples of it, which is
or the
quite
pyramids.
interesting.
The pyramids, because no one believes that. In fact, people would rather believe that the pyramids were built by aliens than believe that they
Hmm.
were built by Africans.
Oh, really? I've only heard well, yes, I suppose aliens are, yes, strange, isn't it?
Much more sophisticated and much more intelligent than Africans would ever be. And so it is fascinating that that oppression that started during colonialism, because they wanted obviously to dehumanize Africans so they can take the land and justify their taking of the land. It's interesting that that's continued up until today. And you think,
Mhm.
but so for me, it always makes me think. I mean, what have you got to benefit from suppressing that history? I mean, it's done. It's done. We are where we are today. We know that what you're saying, is completely false. So why carry on
Mm.
denying what actually happened or what was?
Yes.
I struggle
I
with
think
that.
some of that is just down to funding issues and the fact that people, I mean, there's probably deeper, more dark reasons behind it as well. But I think funding is probably quite a big issue in, if somebody wants to go and do a bit of archaeology in a particular place or some research, they need funds.
Hmm.
And the governments of these various countries probably don't have a big budget for that kind of thing. And universities that do have the budget, maybe they don't have I don't know really how it all works. Jackie, you might know more than me, but the people who agree the funding, if they're not interested in the area, perhaps it all gets channeled other way. I
Or
don't
they
know.
don't see the value. I mean, the governments especially probably don't see the value in archaeology, in history, and in finding out about the past. And to some extent, I can understand if you're struggling to build your roads, modernize your infrastructure, kind of history and archaeology probably would not be a priority, and I can understand that.
Mm,
But I still
mm,
do
mm.
think that we don't value history as a people. We don't value history as much. In fact, I got into an argument with someone once about some African guy who said history was basically useless and it shouldn't be taught in schools. And my argument is, if you don't know where you come from or you don't know your past, how can you know who you are?
Mhm,
And he,
mhm.
he kind of he didn't seem to be able to understand that. I think history is really, really important to people's self-identity and to their cultural identity, who they are. So if you don't know that, who are you? I don't think, yeah.
Look at the conflicts and not just conflicts, the way people trade, the interactions between countries don't just spring out of nowhere. They
Yeah.
are based on so much that's gone before.
Mhm.
That I don't see how you can ignore history in some of these things. I mean, this is well, anyway, I don't want to get into Ukraine and all that, but I'm just thinking, Trump doesn't seem to pay any attention, as far as we can gather, to the arguments. He just, if it's just all about economics and trade-offs,
Hmm.
whereas there's a Russian school of thought that's sort of like this should never have been an independent country, it's part of Russia.
Hmm.
If you don't know that, the history of why somebody thinks that, and to be honest, I don't, but I'm sure I could, research it, and then you're doing diplomacy with that person. If you don't know those backgrounds, how are you going to, I mean, I think history isn't just about one's own identity, although obviously that's very important, but it's about general understanding of the world and why it's not working the way it is.
And I absolutely agree with you. History and what's happened before determines what's happening now.
Mm,
It really does. It
exactly.
has a huge influence on what's happening now. And so if we completely ignore what's gone on before, we're not going to understand why things are happening the way they are or why people hold certain views. The one thing I did want to bring out is again, well, there are two things. First of all, the book is very neutral. She doesn't pass judgment on a lot of things. She doesn't really, once in a while, she'll give her opinion on some things, but otherwise, it's very neutral. There wasn't enough analysis. I don't know if you understand what I
Mm.
mean.
Yes, and I think that's why it is really a beginner's book and an introductory book, because I read somebody else's, it's probably on Goodreads or something, who said there's no sort of overall theme to try to bind the book together.
Mm.
And it's this sort of lack of analysis that I don't know whether that's perhaps because we don't know who is the audience for this book, do you think? Is it a white person who knows nothing about Africa and we're trying to educate? Is that why it's very neutral, so it doesn't upset somebody and they put it down before they've got very far? But
Yeah,
yes, the lack of analysis makes it less interesting, I think.
yeah,
Well, I'm shocked, and I suppose that's just my naivety, the way people don't know anything about the history of Africa. I mean, I thought obviously the Egyptians are, most people in have done something about the Egyptians at school, I suppose, probably
uh,
everybody.
but
But
have
it isn't.
they?
But
Because
well,
I didn't know nothing about Egyptians.
how did you skip it? It's usually the only thing they want to teach.
No,
Anyway,
nothing. There was nothing.
but then it's taught in such a way that you forget that the Egyptians are actually African.
Yeah.
It's very much in its own little box. But then, yeah, it's difficult for me because Jackie, I love history and I love African history. So very little of this came completely out of the blue to me. So I'm sort of shocked at how obviously it does for so many people. But given that that's true, it seems to me the book is Zeinab Badawi saying, look, you guys out there who think nothing ever happened, here's a book about it. And it's not analytical because they haven't reached that, they don't know
Stage
enough
where,
about it to
yeah.
be, to make it analytical.
Uh-huh. Well, yeah, I guess I can understand. I can understand that because it is an introductory book. So maybe me and
Mm.
you were not the right audience to aim this at. So I
Uh,
can totally get that.
I felt that all the time I was reading it. That it's difficult for me to judge this book because it's obviously not written for me. I think it's interesting that my father, who was born in the late 1920s, when empire wasn't something you had to be ashamed of, his his knowledge of history from his school days in terms of the whole sort of colonial thing, it, he knew lots of things. Obviously, he knew it from the British right point of view, I'm not saying he believed that, but that's the angle for which he was taught it. But now it's just like, oh, we don't want to talk about that anymore. So people have no understanding whatsoever. I think it's quite funny, how well, it's not funny. It's shocking.
Yeah, and
But
but
yes,
then there's been a migration away from the humanities, hasn't there? And so it's not seen as important as science, technology, and maths. So I guess
mm,
that's why there's less emphasis on history and knowing
that's,
your history.
yes, but then even the history that you do is very selected.
And aimed at telling a specific point of view.
Yes, yes.
But that's what history essentially essentially is. I mean, isn't it someone who said history is written by the victor, and so he always
Hmm.
tells the point of view of the victor.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah. The hi Taiwo, thanks very much for joining.
Sorry,
Was
I'm
it
late.
church? Was it church?
Yeah, church.
Okay,
Baby
fair enough.
dedication.
Ah, fair enough.
Delayed
We'll let you
things.
off. When I say there was a baby involved, so we'll
Yeah,
let you off.
dedication. Okay, I'll have to remember that excuse next time.
We may not buy it next time.
It's the truth.
Yeah. So we were just really discussing the book and what we thought about it. So I don't know if you wanna just tell us your view of what you thought about the book and what you think about the fact that she's quite neutral in her presentation.
I like that, to be honest. I really enjoyed the fact that not so much that she sits on the fence, but she says that she wants to be even-handed, or at least she has said she wanted to be even-handed in the interviews that I've watched of her when she was promoting the book when the book came out. I agree with some of the negative criticism of the book, where some people were saying, why does she insert herself in the book so much? I didn't really find it problematic. I found it kind of an unusual approach because it's a non-fiction book, but then she's talking about herself, although it's not a memoir. I don't think there's anything wrong in her inserting herself. It's just that it seemed slightly jarring in some ways, where she's talking about people that she spoke with, like African professors of history or African griots or whoever, being very generous with their time. And then she would say, oh, we were here or we were there having a coffee or whatever. It just seemed a bit maybe unusual, maybe not jarring. Maybe that's a better way of putting it, unusual. But I like the way that she's very even-handed in not necessarily criticizing, but not taking a particularly strong point of view. She tries to remain very neutral. I found it refreshing.
I would have preferred if she'd taken a point of view rather than just, sitting on the fence.
It worked for me anyway. It worked.
Okay.
I liked her feminist approach to things because these are, to a large extent, people that I've not come across. But yeah, it worked for me.
Okay, fair enough. We were just, I think, talking about Egypt. The history that's normally talked about Egypt is presented as the Egyptians not being African and not being black. And I think there's a section where she talks about going to visit the Museum of Cairo. And one of the curators that she meets says that it's not really important. The color of whoever it is that built the pyramids and all of that is not important. And I found, I don't know, I just, that did not sit well with me, because I think we already have this myth going around. We are good for nothing. We've never achieved anything. So it is important that actually people know that Black people built these things, and we're building these things way before the Europeans. We had universities in Timbuktu. We had streets with sewers before, when Europe was still in the Dark Ages. So I think it's wrong for him to say that it's not important, the color or the ethnic makeup of the people is not important.
Yeah, but I think that for an Egyptian person living in Egypt, it's that argument that you're making is less necessary than it is for you living here in London, and black people living in London. Because I mean, I found when I was working in Tanzania that people were much less bound up with all that sort of issue because it's sort of like not a question for them. They know who they are, where they are.
But it's a question for Egyptians because Egyptians deny or don't like to admit the fact that the people that were the current Egyptians and the people that were there before now were actually black. When they had that film with Cleopatra, was it Cleopatra or Queen of Sheba? One of them, right? And they used
Cleopatra,
it,
there was an issue, wasn't there?
and it was a black actress, and
Mm.
they were up in saying that she was not black.
But when you look, my view about the color of the people of Egypt in the time of the Egyptians is just to say, well, look at the wall paintings. They show a good color range of people, some very dark, some not so dark. And the current people who live in Egypt are pretty much like that because, and before Islam and all that, they would still have been like that because it's a crossover area, isn't it? You know, people in North Africa, many, you know, the crossing over between the Mediterranean and North Africa and Arab, what's now Arab and Egypt, it doesn't make them less African. That's Zaina's point, is they're African because this is Africa. You know, you can't really get away from it. It's Africa.
Mm.
I can see why you say that, though, Jackie. Although I agree, and at the same time, I equally
I do
disagree.
understand why you say it. Yeah. Sorry,
I mean, it's like
Taiwo.
when I have discussions with some, let's say, friends, and we're talking about degrees or something like that, you know, further education, and we've all got degrees, so we're all very dismissive of these degrees. But the one person there that hasn't got a degree is saying, well, you know, how important it is and the status it gives, and maybe he feels as if he missed out on the student experience, you know, all that went on in university and et cetera, et cetera. But it's easy for us to disdain university education and at least the first degree, although some of them have got second degrees, because they have it. That's why you can easily, you know, just look down on it because, you know, it's no longer an issue. It's no longer relevant. So in the same way, I think that this almost a fixation is because of the climate in which we live and have lived for the past, I don't know, couple of hundred years, where skin color, skin pigmentation, or how it appears is such an issue. It's like racism, isn't it? When you say racism is an artificial construct, but it has real world consequences, it's pretty much the same as that. The color of our skin, although I love the way that she talks about the fact that everyone is from Africa, so everyone is African, doesn't matter what color your skin is. And I like that, although there will still be people that will deny that. But there are always going to be people denying whatever is a fact as an alternative fact because for various reasons it doesn't sit well with them. And again, I go back to the current climate that we're in. The issue of race and racism, we know it has real world consequences, and it's something that is so problematic in our current way of thinking because of how we live our lives and how the modern world is and has been since the whole issue of racism arose. Back in those days, back in, I don't know, was it Roman times, when the color of your skin wasn't the issue, it was more to do with your social background, your class, the family you belonged to, and you could move from one class to another. You could move from being an enslaved person to being an unenslaved person, whether you bought your freedom or you earned it. You could actually assume the highest position, like Otello, I think, or whoever it was, in the land, even though you had a dark colored skin. So the issue of the skin coloration wasn't the fixation, it was other things. It's only now, in the last, I don't know, have 100 numbers of years, that the color
Yeah.
of the skin. And also the other thing is that it's so artificial when we talk about, you know, black, because what is a black person? Is it someone who looks like they're black? Or if they're an albino, are they no longer black? The whole issue of the American issue of passing, it comes into play, doesn't it? Who is black, who is white, who is passing, etc., etc. It's all artificial, but I hear you. It has real world consequences, and the denialists will always deny that. And I mean, it's like geographical location, is it? The pyramids are in Africa; they're on the African continent, and you can't deny that unless you
It's
say that it's
aliens, Taiwo.
aliens.
It's aliens.
Aliens have built it. But the thing is that I love the way that she kind of brought to the forefront the fact that in the Sudan there are hundreds of pyramids, which I didn't know. I've only known about the Egyptian pyramids because, like, these are the big ones.
Yeah.
I've never
There
known
are more
about
pyramids. There are
they're
more
hundreds.
pyramids in Sudan than there are in Egypt.
Yeah, who would have known that? I wouldn't have known it. So
I
that's why I'm
learned that
saying yes,
from
I agree and I disagree equally.
Sandy Toksvig. You should read her book, Between the Stops.
What's it called?
Between the Stops.
You
Okay.
mentioned it.
Yeah, she talks about the pyramids in Sudan, and actually that's where I learned that there were more of them in Sudan than there are in Egypt. But yeah, the book is actually a really great book. She just talks about her journey from home to broadcasting house. But in between that, then she talks about her other aspects of her life.
Okay.
Very interesting. The one thing that's actually she's got in common with this book is feminism. That's one thing that really came out in this book. We don't hear very much about the women in African history, but Zeinab Badawi has done a lot to bring about the story of the women and what the battles that they were involved in and what their achievements were. So you had the Asantewa, you had Queen Nzinga, you had the lady in the Congo whose name I've now forgotten. And then,
is that not Queen Nzinga?
No, she's more what's now, I guess, Angola, Mozambique area, isn't she?
But that covered the Congo, didn't it?
No, Congo's further up, way further up.
Okay, fair enough.
Congo's more Central Africa.
Yes.
Yeah, so I can't remember her name. But then you also had the Ndea women, the one that basically burnt themselves rather than allow the colonizers to come and take them as slaves. So there's a lot of history of women that we don't normally hear about. And that's one thing I really liked about this book is that she's tried to bring the women to the forefront.
Are you thinking, going back to the name, of this one Kimpa Vita in Simba?
Oh, the Black Joan of Arc.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's what I was thinking about. And then there was Abena in Ghana, what is now Ghana, who then went, I think, to what is now Ivory Coast, and who sacrificed her baby to the river so that her people could survive. So there's a lot about the sacrifices and the wars that the women were involved in. And Asantewa, she was wasn't she in her 60s or 70s, fighting off the British, and she was never captured. And she was actually telling the men off, the younger men off, for allowing what was happening to their land.
I thought it was wonderful the way it was covered in this book. But I mean, she's very unapologetic about the fact that she centers women. And so she's looked for particular stories and brought them into prominence. I mean, those stories were always there, just that they were not being told, like you said before. But it's also the strength and the resilience, I guess, not just because they were strong and resilient women, but also because maybe they had to be. And, you know, to actually have a voice in those kind of societies. But at the same time, someone like Nzinga, she was showing certain gifts and talents right from her youth. And I think her father, the king, trained her as if to say she was a son, even though she was a daughter. And the society was quite patrilineal, if that's the right word.
But
so
also,
she go on.
Sorry, Karen. I was just going to ask, you carry on.
No, I was just saying that she was exposed, almost steeped into assuming a particular position, but she had certain gifts and talents which were seen in her. In fact, even with her birth, the whole thing about being born feet first and with the umbilical cord tied around her neck, it gave certain people what's the word? Is it portent? That's it.
Portent, isn't it?
Yeah, of the fact that she was a child that had been waited for, would be gifted and be a great blessing to her people, which she was. Even, I mean, she died in old age. She never got really captured, did she? It was her two sisters that got captured. And even in her late 40s, she's doing the Tarzan to escape from the Portuguese, swinging on across a precipice and ravine on a liana. And the Portuguese tried to follow her. Many of them fell to their deaths. So you can't make it up, some of these stories. I mean, there'd be great films if only people would pick it up and film it. There'd be great films.
It's not in their interest. I know they also probably think it's not going to bring in any money.
It's better than
Anyhow.
saving
Private
Private
Ryan?
Ryan. Yeah, because it's based on fact.
You mean Saving Private Ryan wasn't based on fact?
Well, I'm not lying. I enjoyed it. I mean, there was a lot of artistic license. I love the whole film because he's a really good director, and I do like Tom Hanks anyway. But this is based on fact, so you add the artistic license. It's got all the elements. It's got the drama. It's got the romance. And she was jumping in and out of bed with all kinds of people throughout her life. Married a younger man, much younger than her. I mean, it's got everything in it. It's got everything for a Hollywood drama. If only they would just.
We shouldn't be waiting around for Hollywood to tell these stories, should we? We've got our own film industries. Really should just be putting these out ourselves. But coming back to women, what I wanted to ask is, so it says in the book, and so in Egypt and other parts of Africa, women enjoyed freedom and had equal rights of property and ownership. So there were a lot of societies where actually it wasn't always patriarchy that ruled. I mean, women could succeed and women could rule. So it was really more the advent of Christianity and Islam that then eroded those rights. I mean, when she was talking about Queen of Sheba, for example, she was entitled to property. She could make decisions, and she had just as much of a right to the throne as her male relatives. So I think there were many societies in Africa where that was the case. And it wasn't until the advent of colonialism and then the Islamification of some parts of Africa that women began to lose those rights. And so they then began to get written out of history. The other thing that I kind of wanted to touch on is this idea of slavery. She doesn't go very deep into slavery, but she talks about it a little bit. And so the Arabs on the Swahili coast were already profiting from the trade of humans, and these were black people from mainly the coastal region being taken to places in the Middle East. Not very much is known about the Arab slave trade, and it's not something that's talked about very often. If the Arabs were not already trading in Africans, do you think the transatlantic slave trade would have I was wondering, would the transatlantic slave trade had been as big a thing as it became? And also, why is it that there's not very much discussion on the Arab slave trade?
I don't see myself the impact that it would have had much of an impact on the Atlantic slave trade, partly because it's right round the other side of a very vast continent. But the Arab slave trade was much more focused on collecting women, wasn't it, for harems or whatever you would call them. And And then I don't know if I've got this right, but I have it in my head that although the world's a big place, people began to, know what's going on in different parts of it. I think, like in Zanzibar and round there, when they started growing their clove plantations, then they began to realize, and partly influenced by the knowledge of what was going on in America and the Caribbean area, that the benefit of collecting up male slaves to work in the plantation. Now, I'm not quite sure if there really was some influence, but I think if there was, it was going in the other direction. Not that
as
the
in,
Arab
do you not?
slave trade. Oh, sorry, maybe I misunderstood what you
I
were
was just going to
saying.
ask, do you not think that because the part of the justification by the Portuguese and the Europeans that came after was that actually, well, you're already doing this with the Arabs?
No,
So,
they were already doing it. Well, possibly, I suppose, in North Africa, but I thought I may have misunderstood this. I thought it was more there was a certain degree of internal slave selling
yeah.
between peoples.
Mm.
Mhm.
And I thought it was that made the Portuguese, oh, okay, so these people don't mind selling people. And that gave an impetus. But that was on the West Africa, wasn't it?
Mm.
But the
Well, I don't know. You may be right, because obviously North Africa would have been trading through the Sahara with sub-Saharan Africa. There might be, maybe there was some trade going that way that influenced the Portuguese with more Arab people in Morocco and what have you on the north.
but the
You maybe you're
Portuguese,
right.
the Portuguese kind of arrived in places like Southern Africa because they were looking for the route to
Hmm.
to India, weren't they?
But they'd already been trading around West Africa before they got round to East Africa.
Yeah, but they were not trading in slaves at that point.
Not in a large extent, but I think there was a small trading beginning, but they didn't have. I think it was before they realized, before the whole idea of, oh, we can take all these people over to the Americas to be.
Mm.
I don't know. Maybe I may not be right, and maybe both things contributed. But what the Portuguese encountered in East Africa in those days, I don't know. I think the big slave trading came a bit later, didn't it, with the Arabs? Because don't forget, it's really quite early. It's back to 1400, 1500, when the Portuguese were first there.
And you don't think, well, I can't remember the dates now, but I thought that by then there had already been interaction between Africa on the Indian coast, the Indian Ocean coast, with the Middle
Oh, there was
East.
always.
Yes, I thought
Well,
all
there
of
was
that it
always
was
that.
already
That
there,
goes back to antiquity.
and the
Yeah,
slave
I agree.
trade was already happening at that point. That's what I
Oh,
thought.
yes,
I
I'm
don't think
sure.
that the
I think you were right. Well, maybe it all contributes because ideas flowed around, didn't they? Even, before a modern world.
mm.
Yeah.
Well, I
Sorry,
think
Taiwo. I
commerce.
think.
I was just saying about commerce. Commerce has always been there. So
Mhm.
even before maybe commerce took off to a large, maybe industrial scale, in a way that it was noticeable, it's always been there, as Katrina was saying. So
Mhm.
Africa has traded with all parts of the world, and all parts of the world have traded with Africa from time immemorial. But the whole thing of slave trade, to trade in slaves or enslaved people, I think it's kind of confusing when we use it, because we use it in a modern, generally speaking, we seem to use it in a modern way, where we're just talking about someone you just grab off the street and you say, you're no longer a free individual, you're now an enslaved person, you will work for me for no money, and you've lost all your human rights, etc., and how you're able to do that, and the reason you're able to do that, and so on and so forth. I think because there's always been commerce, there's always been warfare. So there've always been different groups of people, settlements, grouping together, forming, I don't know, kingdoms. So there's always been politics, and there's always been the tension between different groups of people, kingdoms, political systems, therefore warfare. And therefore, when you lose, when one village fights another, you might enslave those people. Or there might be people that are in your society that have been found to be criminals and you decide to sell them as slaves. That's a different kind of enslavement. It's not a trade in slaves as such. It's almost like a punishment, isn't it? Whereas when we talk about slave trade, we normally talk about the transatlantic slave trade because, as you said yourself, Jackie, the people that write the history are the people that kind of are on the top, have come out on top socioeconomically or whatever. They're the ones that say the triangular trade is the most important form of slavery. And that's why all the books, or virtually all the books, are about the triangular trade. To be honest, until I read this book, even though I haven't finished reading it, but I really started getting into Queen Njinga or Zinga. So I know I'm going to have to read it, and then I'm going to have to listen to it, and then I'm going to have to read it again. But I didn't really know much about the whole Arab trade in enslaved people. And as Katrina has said, the fact that the impetus behind it was about women. Women were valued because they needed concubines. I don't know whether that was an Islamic thing about, if I die, I go to heaven and have 21 virgins or whatever. I don't know whether that was part and parcel of it or not. All I know is that they valued the woman and the fact that the woman can reproduce and the fact that they needed more women. Whereas with the transatlantic trade in enslaved people, I think it was to do with the Western industrialization, wasn't it? The need for men, they needed labor, they formed plantations. So it's the whole thing of, rather than cottage industry, we're going to industrialize, but we need the labor and we need cheap labor. We've tried to use brown people. Brown people were wiped out or couldn't cut it for whatever reason. These sturdy Africans, these black people, they will do. We need a reason to be able to justify it. And then you start bringing the whole issue of race and the difference in skin coloration, etc., to justify it. I don't think because the Arab predated, if I'm not mistaken, by far the triangular trade.
Yes.
I don't think necessarily influenced it. I don't think they said, well, you've been selling people. They would have used any excuse. It doesn't really matter. They knew what they wanted to do, and they would have found a way to do what they wanted to do, because for them, as with most people, the ends justify the means.
And then why then do you think the Arab slave trade is not really well known, and we don't talk about it as much as the transatlantic slave trade?
Well, I was wondering if this again does go back to the color issues, because it's such a the transatlantic slave trade has become and was so associated with black people being made to do the being captured and to be sold. In the Arabs were, there was much more mixing, wasn't there? And because after all, if you take women into your harem, inevitably you're going to have children, and those children were valued children on the whole, it seems to me, and a lot more of a positive attitude to the products of that, if you like. And I've read that they also quite like to, if they, rather than getting grown men, they would prefer to get a young boy and then train him and bring him up so he has allegiance to them. He's not being captured so much as he's become an adopted person, and then those people could rise quite high in society. So I guess it becomes a lot more blurred, doesn't it? And like you say, in the African, when it was within the African continent, people could become free, or they could, integrate into the group where perhaps they've arrived there originally as a slave. Whereas none of that was ever possible. And still, the ramifications of the slave trade are very much still with us today, the transatlantic one. And it affects people so much. Whereas, like in the Arab countries, although some of those people their descendants were slaves there, and it's only about the 60s, isn't it? The 50s and the 60s that the concept of slavery was abolished. But then they just become citizens and but there isn't that clear division that you seem to get in America.
But I'd raise a question there, because as an outsider, you being an outsider, me being an outsider, Jackie being an outsider, maybe we don't know. Maybe this is a bit like, the caste system, where with the brown people, Indian, Pakistani, Bangladeshi, maybe some more, I don't know. They themselves know, because when I was reading some of these articles about brown people going to America in Silicon Valley, doing very well, and yet when they want to marry, caste rears its ugly head and it becomes a very big issue, which means that it never went away. So although they're naturalized Americans, or maybe some of them are even born there in America, well, many of them are born there in America, lived and raised there. When it comes to the nitty gritty, it's that kind of thing about, yes, we can all become Englishmen, but would you like your daughter to marry a black Englishman? No, you wouldn't. So it's the same thing, when it comes to your daughter or your son getting married, your grandparents, your parents are going to do the due diligence checks into their ancestry. And if they come from an outcast caste, a lower caste, they're not gonna sanction it. You may say, oh no, we're gonna go with a love marriage, which is why the whole expression even of love marriage is a thing, isn't it? In brown and black, well, particularly in brown communities, it's a thing. This is a love marriage, as opposed to we arranged it through the family, which is how it used to be even in the Western world back in the day. It's a joining together of two families for political, for economic advantage of both families. If there isn't that advantage, then they're not going to sanction it. This whole idea of the concept, going off on a tangent, the idea of love.
I was gonna ask, how does this fit in with the Arab slave or the transatlantic slave trade?
I've gone astray.
I think the point you're making, and I was just sort of having my own second thoughts, is that although, those descendants of slaves in the Arab countries, to us on the outside, they appear to be just Arab citizens. They get all the benefits of the Gulf oil if they live in Qatar or Bahrain or something, but within the society themselves, they quite possibly do. Those differences probably are still recognized.
Yeah, I think they still resonate, even though they may, for the outsider, the casual observer may not notice them, may not even know what the clues are.
Yeah.
For the inside,
because as I was saying that, I was beginning to, think, well, but then, and then you've made that very clearly.
And at the same time, I kept thinking of, I don't know, Things Fall Apart. And the whole thing, the child that is given as a form of,
like a hostage.
No, not hostage.
Well, a guarantee, isn't it? A sort of guarantee of, wasn't? Oh,
was it atonement? Was it more
like an
atonement?
Like restorative justice.
Yeah.
They had killed someone from that village or town, and as part of the restorative justice, they had to give this young boy, as well as do some other things to repay for the lost life. And that child became a part of Okonkwo's family. And so when they told Okonkwo, when they decided, the oracle or whoever decided that they're now going to kill that boy, he should not have a hand in it because the boy calls you father. And yet he chose to go the wrong way, and the rest became history. So it's that the point that you were making, which is where I drifted away from, the fluidity, the fact that you can become a full citizen, but those within will still know that back in the day, your people used to be lower caste, or used to be enslaved, or used to be whatever. It's like old money and new money, isn't it? Class. Maybe here in the Western world, the issue will still be class. Whether you have to go out when your children are going out, or you are going out, setting out in life, do you have to buy your furniture, or do you inherit your furniture? That kind of thing. Old money and new money. Very old money.
Earlier on, Taiwo, you mentioned kingdoms, political systems, warfare. Now, one thing that came out very clearly in the book is the nation building that happened in various parts of the continent. And especially in North Africa, you had the Carthaginians, the Amazigh, and how one group would fight another group, and then the other group would, actually even in Egypt and the Sudan, one group would fight another group, build their kingdom, and then years later they would then be deposed and another group would take over. And so it very much reminded me of Europe. All of those things that were happening there are exactly the same things that were happening in Europe at some point. So why is it that when these wars, European countries, when they fight, it's just part of building nations and so on. But if it happened on the African continent, it was just uncivilized savages fighting each other, because that's what it's presented as. We were running around naked, killing each other because we were uncivilized, and so we needed the Europeans to come and civilize us. But these same things were happening in Europe at the same time, or if not even later.
We were saying earlier about the value of history and why we need history. The whole thing is that in Europe, there are all sorts of books written about why these wars took place or are still taking place, and there'll be more books written. Whereas nobody from Europe at the time bothered themselves to understand the background histories of why this group of people were fighting with that group of people in Africa, because they weren't interested, were they, in looking at colonial times. They were interested in domineering and seeing what they could get out of the country. So there might be a recognition that this group don't get on with that group. There were one or two people who took the trouble, and when I say people, they'd be people with a European style education, if they weren't actually Europeans, to write down about it. Cared to find out the background, doesn't it?
But at the same time, many of them would have had a very poor motive. You're not studying these people for the sake of knowledge. You're not studying these people for the sake of better understanding yourself. You're studying them as an other. Like an anthropology person would go and study these primitive tribes. And then the knowledge is then used against them, isn't it? In the same way, I guess, even in Europe, it would have been the same thing, where you have to know your enemy in order to defeat your enemy. So like Jackie said, in places like, I don't know, Italy, for example, it wasn't an Italian nation back in those days, was it? It was a number of different families. And in Europe or in Britain, it was a number of different fiefdoms, and they're all vying for power. This one rises, this one falls, this one rises, this one falls, just like the Roman Empire. And you expand and you expand and you expand until eventually there's a decline. So it's exactly the same thing, but because you've othered the African, then the process that they are going through, this scramble for power, which is just human. It's just a human foible, isn't it? Where you always want more, and you want more than you need, and you want more because you want to have more than he over there or she over there, so that your status, because you have more, is higher. And it's that same motive that the white man has, that the black man has, that the brown man has. So it's all over the world. These so-called kingdoms are rising and falling. It's just human nature.
It is, but it's, I guess for me the frustration is how it's presented. When one group of people is doing it, it's human nature. When another group of people is doing it, it's they're savages, uncivilized. That's what gets my back up. The one thing that came out really loud and clear in this book is that Africa is no different from any other continent. It really isn't.
Because people are people. I mean,
Yeah.
when you read the histories of the yellow people, the Chinese, the Japanese, you see that
Should you be saying yellow people, Taiwo?
Well, if I'm a black person, they're a yellow person, they're brown people, and they're white people. I'm just using color in the most basic way, not using it in a pejorative way in any way, shape, or form. But I'm simply saying that they would have considered, or they did consider, white people as barbarians, as uncivilized, as unwashed, because they othered them in the same way that white people othered black people. But it's the same thing, isn't it? If you go to Africa and you're a white person and they're saying, oh, Bruni or Yibo or whatever, you're othering these people because you're very different to the majority of people who are maybe dark skinned if it's West Africa. maybe not so in other parts of Africa.
But I guess the difference is, even though you're being othered on the African continent, you're still shown a lot more respect than a black person being othered on the streets of London. That's the
That stands
difference.
to reason, though, doesn't it? It stands to reason, because if you're considering that the color of your skin has a pecking order, on the streets of London, the pecking order is higher than on the streets of Lagos or Johannesburg, because according to the way in which the world has graded how we perceive skin color, the darker you are, the lower down in the hierarchy you are. So yeah, it follows logically.
I would like to challenge that
I'm
and say that.
not saying it's right, Jackie.
No,
I'm
no,
not
no,
saying
no,
it's
no, no,
right.
no,
I'm
no.
just saying
I'm not.
it's
Not even that. Not even that. Do you really think that average black person, a black man on the streets of Lagos is going to look at a white man and say, actually, because his color is lighter, he's somehow higher in the pecking order? It's more what privileges your color gives you. It's not, they're not thinking that you're any better. Whereas on the streets of London, a white person looking at a black person will think that they're better. On the streets of Lagos, it's more because of the color of your skin, you have more privileges. I don't know if that makes sense. If you get what I'm trying to say.
Yes, I do. I think it's all to do with the white skin in Africa is usually associated with being rich.
Yeah, exactly.
There's
Yeah.
the assumption that you're worth robbing, perhaps. Whether, that may not be true, but that's the assumption. And therefore you might get privileges on that basis. But if you are a wealthy looking African person and you're walking around, people will also make that same assumption and perhaps look after you in the hope they're going to get something, a reward for doing so at the end of it all.
If you're a wealthy African person walking on the streets of London, no one's going to think that you're.
It's less certain what the outcome will be.
Yeah.
But if you're a wealthy black person, wealthy African person walking on the streets of London, then you're in a white majority space, aren't you? And that means that has certain implications.
But so is a black, white, what's the word, man walking on the streets of Lagos.
Yes, and that also has implications. But the point that I'm making is, on the global scale, you're talking about the way individuals think or the way individuals view the world. Like the person that's grown up having been to Eton, and he has certain expectations of how his life is going to turn out because he's been raised in that way to think, I'm the master of the universe, or I'll be a master of the universe. So it's the same, isn't it? Maybe the average white person, or maybe an average white person, might think he is superior to an average black person, but it's because of how he has been raised.
So my position is Africa's wealth is also its curse.
I think it's only its curse because the fact that we allow various interests to hijack what should be used. I mean, if we were like Wakanda and we were able to hide ourselves away from these various interests, and the interests are not just external, the interests that have nothing good for us as a community, as a continent, they're also internal, as Professor Kehinde Andrews would explain. The elites, many of whom have been educated in the global north, and then they come back and they make all these deals, and the way in which they view the extraction of wealth. So the extraction of wealth doesn't just include mineral resources, it also includes people, the extraction of wealth, and it includes taking their minds. What is the purpose of education? Who does it benefit? And why does an educational approach take a particular road, maybe veering to the left or veering to the right?
It seems to me that the Zeinab Badawi might not have done much analysis, but we're doing some of it for her. And I just wondered, I couldn't remember where she spoke about the wealth and the extraction in particular. Maybe that's probably me just not remembering. Was it at the end in the chapter about resistance and liberation? Did she talk about it? Because I'm afraid I've forgotten.
I don't know that she did. I don't
About
know.
that, Jackie.
I don't know that she did. I can't remember if she did, but for me, that kind of came across as I was reading. As I was reading the book, I was just thinking, well, the Europeans obviously came and settled because they wanted the wealth. So look at what they did to the Herero people in Southern Africa. They
Namibia.
wanted the land,
Mm.
right? They wanted the land, and then they wanted the diamonds in Botswana and South Africa. So they were all coming for the wealth that was on the continent, and that has continued really throughout since their arrival. That's where the scrum for Africa started off in the first place.
Mhm.
So that kind of came through for me as a thread as I was going through. But I don't know. I can't remember if Zeinab Badawi actually talked about that at all.
Actually, I'm just looking. There's a chapter called Land, Gold and Greed, and she touches on Cecil Rhodes and his exploits. So, although she mostly seems to me to, if I remember correctly, to be talking about the like Chaka Zulu and people connected with him. I
Mm-hmm.
suppose because, but yes, it sort of, she does touch on it, and I can see why you started to think about it. But I don't think she says a lot about it because she's trying to emphasize the African history that was going on with the movement of people because of Chaka Zulus.
Yeah.
I don't disagree with anything you and Taiwo were saying regarding the exploitation.
So I guess yeah, I'm probably drawing to an end. Kind of wanted to know if there anything that you learned about the history of Africa that you were not familiar with, and what you take away from this book. For me, I didn't know about sickle cell, and actually that. Well, no, I knew about sickle cell, the disease, but I didn't know the link with malaria. I don't know if you remember she discussed malaria and how actually if you're a carrier, then you're less likely to contract malaria. I didn't know that, so that for me was
Okay.
quite eye opening. And then there are obviously all the history of North Africa. I haven't studied very much North Africa, so for me it was very eye-opening, the history of the Amazigh people, the Carthaginians, how Algeria and came about, and then also just Egypt. There's so much. When Egypt is always something that we just assume that we know about, but actually, for me, there's so much in this book that I wasn't aware of. The pharaohs and how they came to power, how they passed power along, the religion, who they believed in, and the gods that they believed in. All of that I found really fascinating, and it's good to actually read it from an African perspective rather than from watching a film. I actually really like this book, despite the lack of analysis, because I learned. I feel that I've learned a lot, and I am actually going to pick chapters and read them again, and then go to other sources and see if I can find more detailed information on those areas.
What you said about North Africa and the Amazigh, I know very little about that, and I read through it, but I'd need to go back and read it with concentration to recall it. You know, if you tested me on it, I'd be useless. But it was interesting at the time I was reading it. You were talking about the importance of the seeing the pyramids as a building done by African people. Fine. But what I think is interesting is the Benin City walls and that have been not just obliterated virtually more or less entirely in real life, but obliterated from history more or less entirely.
Yeah.
And I don't think anybody would be trying to argue that they weren't built by African people, sub-Saharan black African people. I don't think there's much of an argument would take place there. Also, of course, with Great Zimbabwe, I mean, it's pretty well. I think there's still people who want to say it wasn't built by black African people, but they're a very small number now. But they still exist, I believe. They prefer the alien theory, I expect. But I would like to know a lot more about Benin City, and I really ought to make the effort to source material. Yeah, that's where I'd like to go deeper.
I mean, I definitely will be going deeper. And the email that you shared with me about from Isaac Samuels, I shared it with my brother, who's very much into Yoruba ancient history, and he hadn't heard of him. So he was really, he's like, yeah, I'm really going to get into this. He was overjoyed. So yeah, thank you for that. I think the chapter Cast in Bronze is something I need to go into because of the whole, the whole way in which the Benin people were using bronze in such an intricate way. And the Benin bronze is being so emblematic, a bit like the Elgin marbles, isn't it? Yeah. It says a lot about how developed their societies were. There's so much more that we don't know if people could find out, it will be amazing. And like you said, the walls around the city.
Greater than the Great Wall of China.
Which I never knew. And I still find it hard to believe. But then again, when you've been fed so much and it's all about the Great Wall of China and people going on it and films about it, but nothing about the Great Walls of Benin, then it sounds like a fiction. For me, definitely the Kingdom of Kush, because the Kingdom of Kush is where Egypt is now. So the nation of Egypt covers...
Isn't it Sudan? I thought the Kingdom of Kush is where the Sudan is now.
I think the Kingdom of Kush, because at the beginning of each chapter, she shows the part of Africa where that kingdom is. Okay. And that covers the western half of Egypt.
It might overlap. Does it overlap with
Sudan?
Egypt? Surely overlap with Sudan. Yeah.
Yeah. It kind of goes down, doesn't it? North to south. It's covering half of Egypt, or almost half of Egypt, and a chunk of Sudan. Not South Sudan, but Sudan. So for me, that's something that I need to look into. I find that this book is very much, I don't know whether the right word is a primer. It's a book that kind of gives you access.
An intro.
Like a teaser. Yeah, that's it. An intro, an introduction into things that you need to go into deeper when you find that there are particular areas of specific interest to you. For example, the whole form of slavery that the Arabs, which predated the triangular transatlantic slavery, were pursuing. That is something I want to explore in much more detail as well. So I love the way that, and the book is big enough as it is. I mean, I've now got the paper copy, which is smaller, but it does mean as if to say everything is kind of packed in together. It's quite thick. But had she kind of gone deeper into certain things, the book would have been twice as big or 3 times as big. It had to be superficial. It had to be broad brush strokes for her to be able to cover the whole area of history that she wants to cover for a whole continent. Bearing in mind that she's talking about the whole world through one continent anyway. So there was just so much that I didn't know, and I've not read all the book. So there's still much more for me to learn. But certainly Kush and the enslavement of people through the Arabs, those are the 2 main things that I would very much be interested in looking into in more detail.
Okay, so overall then, how would you rate the book and would you recommend it?
I'm going up in my estimation.
Okay.
Because I've read more of it now. And when I was reading Queen Zinga, I could barely put it down because I was really getting into it. And I kept thinking, I know that obviously she's going to die eventually because, this happened long time ago. But I just kept, like a hero where you don't want the hero to die. You always want the hero to escape.
Yeah.
So I'm reading it, and each time she's escaping, I think, John Wayne. John Wayne.
John Wayne, not even, Wonder Woman. John Wayne.
It's a Nigerian thing. It has to be John Wayne. John Wayne.
Fair enough.
Either that or Jason Bourne. Jason Bourne. But yeah, I'm going up to 4.6. I will highly recommend it. 4.6, I highly recommend it. I haven't finished reading it even now, but I've got a taste for it. But I need to put it to one side to read the book that is coming up in 2 weeks' time. I want to make sure I finish it. I don't want to fall back into a habit of not finishing books before we discuss them. I think she's done a wonderful job. I recommend it highly.
And Katrina?
Yeah, I would recommend it to anybody who wants to start learning about African history. I would give it a 4. What detracts from it for me is the fact that it is very much like her style is documentary because that's what she's done before. And you feel like all this business, like you said, Taiwo, if she's sitting down having a cup of coffee with this historian or another, you do feel like there's a television screen, except it's not there. You could see it as it would be in a documentary, and that doesn't appeal to me so much. But for me, I think I'll stay with 4.
As a starter and as an introduction, I think it's a really good book. It's very easy to read. History books are normally quite boring, unfortunately, because they're very factual. But this one wasn't. This one, like Tayo was saying, he wanted to find out about Nzinga and what was going to happen next, and he didn't want to put the book down. It's that kind of book where once you get into it and you're reading about whatever it is she's writing about, you actually want to read it to the end. Whereas that's not what you normally get with many history books. So because of that, I rate it really highly. I mean, I give it a 4.5 out of 5 because I think she's actually, despite putting herself in the book, she's done an amazing job of introducing Africa and telling the African story from an African perspective. And despite being a bit neutral and not having as much analysis as I would have preferred, I still think it's a great book. So yeah, I definitely give it a 4.5 out of 5. So
you're one of
there we
those,
are.
you're one of those that didn't like the fact that she inserted herself in the narrative.
No.
Okay. There are a number
No,
of people that didn't like that.
I didn't, yeah.
You say there isn't much about African history, and in comparison with European history, I would agree with you. But actually, I think there's lots. But the problem is, it is mostly written at an academic level. So it's
By
really,
who? By who?
oh, I mean, it depends where you're looking, doesn't it? Which part of Africa, which specific thing. But if you're asking me if it's by white Europeans, a lot of it is, but not all of it at all. I'm more and more finding there's articles by people from the country, wherever it is, like, for example, Tanzanian historians, archaeologists doing it, but not to the same level, the same volume as you get in Europe. But it's out there. But it is academic stuff. You've got to dig.
It's not accessible.
And yeah, it's not accessible. And I'll tell you the other thing, if you really want to Google away to find things, I've discovered sometimes when I went through a phase when I was intensely researching things to do with Tanzania. People who have Facebook pages where they've collected up all sorts of local stories and information from their grandfathers or whatever it is. I mean, there is stuff, but it's not accessible. You're absolutely right. You've got to really want to find it.
You have to do
So Picasso had his blue period and Katrina had her Tanzanian period.
Exactly. But I find these sort of weird, or not weird, but somebody's writing a Facebook page, and because luckily if it was in Swahili, I could usually pick out enough of it at that time. Probably can't now. Yes, because then local historians do, who are writing in that sort of way on Facebook and things, they may be writing in their own language. So yeah, that also makes it less accessible to, if you're trying to convince a white European audience, there really was a very interesting and complex history going on in Africa before any European was interfering. They're not going to read that, are they? If it's in a different language, which is always language. But that's always the problem, because there's stuff. The French seem to do a lot of archaeology, but obviously they write it up in French. And yes, you can get an abstract that's in English, but if you're not fluent enough and even if you're reasonably, you can read, you've got to still plough through.
Anyhow, that was an African history of Africa. Join us next time when we will be discussing Anansi's Gold, the man who swindled the world. Until then, goodbye.